Welcome to the MF, that is the masculine feminine quadrant, where we'll be breaking down distinctions and exploring the four corners of the two dual forces of masculine and feminine creation. Join us for some deeply reflective and penetrating conversation and an exchange of energies to open your body, your mind, and your being.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I was looking forward to this episode. I think this is really tough, and I think it's really important. I know.
Where am I positioned? Am I positioned in the side of the spectrum where it's more healthy, or am I positioned in the side of like I like conflict? You know,
How can I find ways to still express myself? How can I still find ways to navigate in the world where I can be authentic, but still be the peace lover that I am? And ultimately, that's where I will lean more into. It's like I'm
navigating like some relationship I was in that I really shouldn't have been in because she was already in a relationship, like navigating those dynamics and
like, you know, so like, I guess, yeah, like conflict kind of feels like a longer road, whereas an argument feels like a one-time event. But
oh my God, we really are polar opposites, because I was thinking you were saying the exact opposite. Holy.
And that's ultimately what we want, right? I think that's like, you know, that we're trying to create greater understanding within our relationship. So at least that's often where you're trying to get to when you're
Right.
seeking solution.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you again for tuning in this weekend to a motherfucking podcast. I'm here as always every week on the dot. 7 o'clock on the dot. I'm in my top. Ooh, with Shaka. How you feeling today?
Good. Yeah. Ready, raring to go. Tuck into
Yeah, I know you are ready for this one. Yeah. She's like, if you're not watching the video, she is itching for this. She's itching for it. And I ain't gonna lie, I'm a little hesitant, but you know what? I'm with it. Let's do it. So we really wanted to stir the pot with this one. And this is something that presents in a lot of relationships, a lot of business relationships, a lot of family dynamics, even friendships. And it's navigating conflict. And how do we actually do that? Because ultimately, we have these two systems of like, are we actually navigating the conflict that whether we're going to get into whether we created that conflict, or if we're just prone to more conflict, or are we actually creating healthy resolution, you know? And this is something that we consistently speak about, which is like the basis and more of like the foreground and the back end of a lot of our episodes, which is, you know, the ways in which we do things, you know, like where is this actually stemming from? And it's called result-based action or result-based thought. You know, like, are we doing this action or thinking this thing because of the end result that we want to create? And ultimately that's tapping into the creator that we are. So this comes from a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about. You know, we're going to mention the shadow in this. We're going to come from that perspective and really what that looks like. But essentially, we're going to be looking at this resolution, and if we're really actually truly and authentically deep down to our core resolving the issues at hand, or we just really navigating this conflict so well that we end up just out of it, and then boom, the pattern repeats again. So Shaka and I are going to share our experiences, mine definitely personally, and yeah, 100% from the shadow aspect as well, because for me this one came up with the navigating conflict as far as being the creator that I am, a very sacredly driven, noticing how we're actually creating all the time. You know, whether we say something to somebody or we think something in our mind, we're creating with that. It just depends how much power we give it to, or how much power is in that momentum of that mechanism that's in the way. So for me, navigating this conflict was really looking at, okay, where am I positioned? Am I positioned in the side of the spectrum where it's more healthy, or am I positioning the side of like, I like conflict? And this was something that I learned with myself, is like being this master of resistance and the shadow coach and, you know, all of these different things. It's like, I like that resistance so much because I know what's on the other side, you know? So yes, I am result-based thinking and creating result-based actions, but it's like, where can we dial that back and start to go into that other side? So I would also notice that, and I know you speak a lot about this, Shaka, is about how things show up in the relational space, and it's so much different with the self, and then when you have like that reflected self, you know. So for me, it presented a lot in relationships, and I was noticing like where that came from, you know. Like in my younger years, I was really witty, you know, and this is kind of the premise that I want to draw on a lot, is like, sometimes we do it from a really well placed intentional space of like a power that we have or a strength that we've developed through the years. So it may seem like it's coming from this beautiful place, but also those ways of being need to be checked as well. So it was like this witty way of, you know, whether it was navigating the different people in the different hoods that I was in, or like navigating like some relationship I was in that I really shouldn't have been in because she was already in a relationship, like navigating those dynamics, and like looking at these things of saying like, okay, well, I'm really good at this, so keep it up, you know. And it's like you give that pep talk, but you keep perpetuating that, rather than looking at those situations and saying, okay, like, what's the healthy thing for me, like, to sustain myself long term, but I can still utilize those tactics and those mechanisms that are already in place. So I want to take a position of more cognitive behavior therapeutics on this, and I want to definitely share with our audience some practices that I'll drop in here, because this is also something that comes up for men 100%. Like, we are consistently dealing with, like, I'm not saying that women aren't, but I'm just saying we always create these conflicts, you know, and then it's like, ah, fuck, like I shouldn't have been in that, but this is how I'm going to navigate it. And it's like, oh, okay, then I finally got out of it. But we miss so many of those like quality gems. So, yeah, I want to see where this question and this topic came up for you in your aspect. Like, how did you attach to it and allow it to assimilate?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I was looking forward to this episode. I think this is really tough, and I think it's really important.
What?
I know, definitely, and I think it's important to say. I think conflict, first of all, I think we should like just. I feel like this is a layered subject. I feel like we could do at least 3 shows on this and like really explore it in layers and layers. And I think it's important to say that there's kind of like there's obviously internal conflict, there's interpersonal conflict, and then there's obviously like the world stage conflict like war and things like that. So I think what we're really talking about here is interpersonal conflict that happens between people, right? Whether that be in
I'm gonna talk about it all.
Well, all right, we could talk about it. I mean,
no, you can keep it interpersonal, because I feel like my internal conflict is like the war in Palestine, you know? It can relate. I feel like it is the macro and the microcosm. But go ahead.
I guess it is all related, of course. And yeah, and I think all of us have a different relationship with conflict. And I think it's important to say conflict is a normal, healthy part of relationships, because we are human beings, we're adults, we have competing needs, and we have things going on. Like you said, we've got our wounds, our shadows, our history, our adaptive strategies, like all of this kind of stuff. And we've got all of this personality that we bring into our relationship. So it's kind of par for the course. So I think the first thing is to say is that conflict isn't a sign that a relationship is unhealthy. That's not the barometer. I think the way that conflict is resolved, this is why we called it resolving conflict, because I think it's the way in which resolutions are created. And I think there's some really, really interesting work around this. That you know, when we do navigate it, we've got some skills, we've got some knowledge, and there's some awareness around it. So I mean, there's a saying, you know, there's two sayings. There's like, you know, what, like sometimes we want to build bridges, sometimes we want to burn bridges. So I think there's a really important, like, you know what I mean? There's a real important distinction about knowing kind of like
Right.
when conflict is healthy, like when it's productive, like when there is something to like, you know, something that can emerge on the other side. Often it actually creates deeper connection, deeper intimacy, deeper understanding. But if we don't fight in the right way, then often conflict can lead to separation, things and things like that. So I think it's really, really important, because I think we really always need to know like how conflict is showing up and how we choose to resolve it. And
Right.
you know, and I think it would help us a lot in our relationships, because it's happening anyway. So if we can have better tools of how to navigate it, then hopefully we can have healthier, stronger relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, like I said, I love the resistance. I love the conflict. I love the challenge, because it's like that. It's that juicy, savory stuff for me, you know. And just like you said, it's, I think that's the point, is like when we can determine and really discern like what this conflict means to us, and how does it look like internally, and sometimes like how am I presenting that interpersonally, you know, in this relationship, whether it be with work, whether it be with my friends, with my spouse, whatever it is, with my kids, you know. And it reminded me of this this blog that I did about eustress and distress, right? And from that lens, I took a lens of like fitness, you know, like there's this eustress, like this euphoric stress that we put ourselves through, that we know when we tell ourselves is okay and it's good and it's going to give us the benefits and X, Y, and Z. And then there's that distress where these things are actually causing you harm to your specific system, whether it be your cardiovascular system or, you know, your central nervous system. And I think it's important for us to identify that. So I do have like 3 body balancing techniques that I put in that blog, and I'll put the link in the bottom. And these are like some meditations. One is somatic, one is more visual, and one is more kinesthetic. So whatever kind of person you are, if you want to take on some of those manual at-home practices, you can check that out. But this for me was one of these conflict like identifying, I guess I could say. And I didn't identify it until it just came about. That yeah, I may like this conflict inside because I have built this capacity to understand it and know it. But it's like, how do we communicate that to another? You know, how do we communicate that and see it also from the outside? And this is kind of like what you were saying, this, you know, there's this echo, like there's these 3 different kinds of, you know, conflict that happen. And for me, I see it in that whole, in that totality. So when I have been in relationships before, it's like, okay, Max, you know that you can go through this, you can go through this, you can go through this. But when I was doing that with my partner at the time, it was like not thinking that I'm putting them through it as well. And they're looking at me like, you're putting me through this, you know? And it was really just relational stuff. So the relational things that were happening, I'm like, oh, cool. Like we're arguing about like how much, you know, food is done, or like who got home first and didn't take out the garbage. Like, yeah, that's fine. I'm with that. Like, let's go into it. What can we undig from here? You know? And they're like, what? Like, you want to cause a fight? Like, you want to do this? And I'm like, didn't you know this shit was going to happen? You know? So it's like, how do we get into those spaces? And this was that first question of like, what does conflict mean to me and my association with it? So I was associating this conflict that's happening is like, oh, this is good that we're going through this because we're going to get something at the other end. Like, let's look at this. It's not my fault. It's not your fault. And sometimes I was approached with that in like, oh, well, it's your fault, you know? And sometimes I feel like in relationships, we can do that. And I feel like also there's this external, like, yeah, when you look on the macrocosm, like you brought up war, right? It's still just conflict between 2 dynamics, 2 systems that are in the world, whether if it's 2 countries, 2 ethnicities, to people, you know, if it's your spleen in your esophagus not are, you know, agreeing on the food that you just ate, like it's going to cause conflict regardless, you know. And yes, there's different scales, and we're not going to get into semantics about, you know, a war in another country to, you know, you deciding that you don't want to be with your partner because they're freaking annoying. But these conflicts that show up are normally from our internal resonation, that we have these mechanisms that seek out that conflict, and we're not necessarily tuning our central nervous system or our biological body to find actual resolve, because we're not solving this problem like truly, because we haven't truly felt like, okay, what is this healthy thing that I'm looking to create, you know. It's just like, oh, this is something that's here and I need to navigate around it. Because if you built that association with it, for example, like how I was explaining how I navigated through, you know, the hood and like the environment and things like that. And it was like, not to say, I mean, my neighborhood was pretty bad, but it wasn't like the worst, you know. But the way that I learned how to navigate my natural and true and authentic skills and traits, it started to form and shape me, you know. So I think this is the part where we have to kind of understand of, it's, everything is relational, you know. And whether it be, you know, your internal conflicts or these external conflicts, it determines how we relate to them. So one thing for me that I did was I started to realize, like, okay, where is the pattern? You know, like what thing is most common and how can I shift that without blame, without judgment, and without, you know, this pushing it away, because it is a part of me. And I was like, oh, well, it's this concept of you being so like malleable. And yeah, I can throw it into like me being a Pisces and being a mutable sign and do all the spiritual bypassing. But I think that is the part too, is like when we start to identify these things, they make you so much more aware of the surrounding mechanisms that are there. You know, I could have fell into the spiritual bypass. I could have fell into the ancestral trauma. I could have fell into, and it's like, no. But can we truly, authentically look at ourselves and say, I'm choosing to resolve this because I'm aware of it, and now I'm placing my consciousness on it. And that's something I want to talk about a little bit later, about that process of being aware. So that was just one of my practical things that I looked at, that I was actually doing, that I had a trait that was in me, and saying like, okay, Max, this is how you associate with this thing. Like, this is how you see conflict, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's for everybody around you or even for the world. How can you take that association of being malleable and moving around these things and that navigating skill, and refine that and help a person that is in there with you, that's taken this boat or, you know, this partnership with you, or a friend or whatever, and utilize that to help them see you clearer and more authentically.
And that's ultimately what we want, right? I think that's like, you know, that we're trying to create greater understanding within our relationships, or at least that's often where you're trying to get to when you're seeking a solution, right? And yeah, it's really interesting. So I think it's so funny because we always like somehow take the opposite, right? We're like, you're like, yeah, lean into it. Whereas me, I am like literally like, like conflict. I hate it. I really, really like, I will do anything to avoid conflict nowadays. And then that wasn't always like that. Because when I was younger, I was like, I was a fiery.
I know, because that last episode, you was like, I was out there rocking rough and tough with my Afro puff. They ain't want it on these streets. I threw out my cardboard box and I pop locking, chick dropping. You was out there with it. So yeah,
I want
to see how this goes.
I was never afraid of conflict when I was younger. I mean, in fact, I'd be starting the conflict. I'd be like, yo, man, I'm just in a bad mood, so let's just start this. So it was really, but obviously really unhealthy. I had a lot of anger, I had a lot of energy, and just a lot of passion, and I just didn't know what to do with it. And often this would result. And so I think as I've got older, I think because I had such an unhealthy relationship with conflict when I was younger, I think as I've got older, like my my thing is just to shy away from it now, because I'm just like, oh, it's ugly, I don't like it, and shy away from it now. And then so I think my middle ground that I'm coming to, learning, sort of wibbly wobbling back to, which is like, no, like it's normal, part of relationships. But I think I think it's really important. I think about my friends and the people that I know who have like who are like got a healthy relationship with conflict. Basically, people who are able to argue, resolve, and move on. And basically, where we have examples of where we see that where relationships have mini ruptures, but ultimately they find a way to move on from that.
And mend it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's just something that's like, I think that is something that we learn. Like, so if that hasn't been mirrored to us in our childhood, I think it's like something you really have to learn. So I think, I would say like my conflict for me means lack of harmony, right? Because harmony is like when it's all flowing, it's all going, everything's going the same way. And like, we all know, like, and I guess you could say like order and chaos, right? And they're both related, right? So obviously sometimes we need to kick up the dust. Like there's a card in the tarot, 5 of Wands. I like this like kind of kick up dust. It was like kind of the rub, like rubbing against each other, like, you know what I mean? And that's like part of what shifts things, what moves things. If everything's just flowing and flowing and flowing, well, that's nice. But sometimes things need to shift. We need to change things. We need to, so you need the rub in order to create something new. New things come from that. So I understand that now. But in the tarot, there's also another card, which is the 5 of Swords, which is a little bit more spiteful and a little bit more like, like a little bit more mean, like it's not necessarily like, rubbing up against each other and it's uncomfortable and it's sticky and icky and you've got to kind of roll up your sleeves and get stuck in. It's like, it's actually like, where things get nasty, where spiteful things are said, or you know what I mean, or things are said in anger, or maybe like people are raising their voices and things like that. And so I think there's really like making a distinction. And I guess I'm thinking about the Gottmans again, bringing them in with their aged wisdom on relationships and obviously a long marriage. And so I think they've written a book called Fight Right, which they kind of talk about how to basically how to have fights in the right way that do ultimately bring resolution. But I think my association is just like, I'd rather not do it, but it's got to be done.
So I hear you when you say that, and I feel like I want to throw myself in there. And I came from a position, I feel like association comes from like where that root stemmed from. And I think it was so beautiful that you said that there within conflict, you had this passion, and you had this drive, and you had these emotions, and you just didn't know what to do with them. And that's why you caused conflict. Do you feel like that is the original association, and then you ultimately got to the point where you just shy away from it? Like, how was that process there?
Oh, it's hard to answer. So we're going a bit deep. Yeah. I think that.
All right, so I'm gonna give you a little buffer in a window, right? Because when I hear that, right, I can't help but think of the kinesthetic therapist that's in me and the somatic coach is like, okay, that central nervous system of like when you have this pendulum swinging from like completely conflicts, like I'm gonna do nothing, and where is that swing back, or are you feeling like you are here now and you're kind of coming back? So what was in your system? Because I also know that you were like also in activism and things like that, and that passion and that dream and that fight for justice. It's like that seemed to get channeled in that way, but I'm not sure if that was like a channel to that transformation into like now you shy away from it in the relational sense, because when you're advocating for something, that's like the bigger scale conflict that you spoke of. But then you also were talking about how when you're rocking rough and tough with your Afro puffs, that's that interpersonal, like all the emotions that you didn't know really what to do with. So when you look at that contrast, how do you feel like that association has shifted for you as you've found the way of yoga and
Yeah,
found
I mean,
peace?
I was about to say, because I think it's more to do with yoga. I think it's when I started practicing yoga. I mean, I was just like, I mean, I was out there. I was out there. Anyone knows me, you know, before I was 21, like
Yeah, so
they
talk
know
about
they
me
know a
too.
very different, they know a very
Come
different
get it.
woman to the one sitting
Let's get
here, which
up.
is, you know,
Right.
as it should be, right? And I just had a lot of energy. I had a lot of energy, and I just had a lot of, you know, I just had a lot to say, and a lot to, you know, I was a lot to express, and it just came out every kind of way, like either through my music or like, you know, I just was just very, very expressive. And then I think when I found yoga, that was when like I think when I first started practicing yoga, it was really about, oh no, I want to be a yogi. Yogis are peaceful, and like, so I think it was about adopting a kind of persona that was about peacefulness, and I was going to be a spiritual person now, so I was going to change that pattern, and then I think it's evolved into something more authentic now, where I think because I know, maybe because I know that's within me, that like I'm like, you know, I'm just like, you know, it's in there still, and I really don't want to, I don't want to bring that side of myself out into the world, because I do think it was incredibly negative. I do think it came from a very unconscious place. And so like, so I think there's a kind of thing now where I don't feel like it's to do with my nervous system. I feel like it's more to do with how can I find ways to still express myself? How can I still find ways to navigate in the world where I can be authentic but still be the peace lover that I am? And ultimately that's where I will lean more into. It's like, I'm a peace lover, you know, I enjoy harmony, I enjoy peace, I particularly in my relationships, and I definitely don't, you know what I mean, like endeavor to start conflict. So yeah, I think that's kind of where it's like kind of emerged. And I think yoga has definitely served to kind of like, yeah, mellow me out and like channel some of that energy a little bit more productively. And the activism and the music, all the different things that I did, I used a lot of what I used was anger. That was kind of how I, you know, that was how I got my energy to do things. So it was productive in some sense.
Right.
Because it was like
And
a
I think
fire.
that's like the beauty. Yeah, because I see that as the alchemist in me is like, that's fire. Like you use that as fuel. And
Yeah.
like for me, I've always had that, you know, like this alchemist, like I'm talking about the point of view, you know. So as you're speaking, I'm looking at the beauty in that whole process, and I'm like, come on, say it. Like I see it, but tell me something else. So there's like this, and I mean, I know that I went through it, but to hear that from you of how you kind of were just like feeling in the dark and just feeling out these different things, and like, okay, music and activism, and I want to fight for this and I want to do this, and like this kind of like reaching out, and then finally like, oh, yoga, I want to put this on, and this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to focus, and I'm going to organize, and I'm going to do ashtanga, and I'm going to go through this leg, and I'm going to practice ahimsa, and there's all these different ways to kind of organize and do something with that energy. And I feel like that is the part like where we create more space, you know, like you ultimately said, is if we're navigating, if we're learning to navigate conflict and we were never taught to resolve, then we have these two ends of the spectrum that we're just kind of like feeling around in the dark, you know. And most of us, we have that, you know, from our childhood on, you know, because our parents were like, oh, what the fuck, you know, the lucky ones. Yeah, maybe you have both parents that were like, oh, we know what the hell we're doing, and we're going to make you fucking perfect. But then also we're going to give you expectations and entitlement and blah, blah, blah. So, you're in this with us too, motherfuckers. Anyway, so I see that as like, you know, I see that in a lot of men, right? Is what I notice is that it's hard to create space. And for me, I'm like, I feel like that is literally the only thing that men should be creating, you know, is like creating space. It's like, that's the material that we fuck with, you know. And I try to get them to, this is where I'm doing a lot of the men's work in that direction. But this brought me to that second question of like, where can you expand more into that resistance within our life? Because when you think about it, like I'm going to bring you guys into my personal like mindset. When you're this energetic being, right? Whether you want to look at yourself like a torus field, you want to look at yourself as a glowing body of light, as source energy, whatever it is, there comes a point where we have to organize these things. So when we have conflict, all of these different energetic systems that we have in our body, whether they be our organs, whether they be our biological body, our mental, our chakras, whatever, however you want to ideate them, right? This conflict is resistance, it's contraction, and it's expansion. You know, just like how our lungs, when you inhale, your lungs expand, and then they have to contract to push out all the old air, and it keeps the system going. So the same thing in these relationships, like you said, is like a little bit of conflict is healthy. The right amount of conflict is healthy, but it's also like, how do we relate and how do we respond to that? Because if we're looking at this conflict just to go through it, or like, oh, just like most men are like, oh, I just want to get to the other side of this argument, you know, like, oh, I'm not going to say anything, or oh, I'm just going to be passive, and like she'll stop arguing with me, or like they'll stop doing this. And it's like, that's not getting through it, you know? And also a lot of men take that position with emotions, right? Like we don't necessarily have this, or we're taught this way to go through the emotion. It's like, oh, this is what you're feeling, either like push it here or just like get to the end of it. It's like, okay, once you're at the end of it, okay, great. You know, and I see this now with this new wave of, you know, wellness renaissance, and these heart-centered leaders, and these men that are just like, yeah, just cry, you know, just cry. And it's like, yeah, actually crying isn't always good for you, because then you're just pushing out that emotion rather than going through the process of what that is, and then seeing what is that outlet, you know, because the emotion is just that energy that's in motion, kind of feeling around in the dark. So when we don't have a lot of space in our body, whether it's emotional, whether if it's mental, whether if it's intellectual, even if it's biological, you know, if you have this narrative in your head that's like body shaming you, or you're talking about like how you shouldn't be eating, but you consistently eat, it's like that's that habit. And this is where that conflict starts to happen, because you have this one side of you that's saying one thing and this other side of you that's saying one thing. So if we don't create that space within ourselves, then we're not going to be able to have room to kind of feel around in the dark and see our ways of expression and our ways of moving that energy through, or moving those conflicts through. So for me, that was my position in leaning into the resistance and becoming the master of resistance, you know, because I was like, okay, you know, me with my words, I was like, all right, if this ego, right, he wants more, okay, I'm going to give you more, but I get to decide what more is. I made a truce with him. He's like, all right, fine. What does it mean? And I was like, we're going to be a master of resistance. He was like, wait, what? And I was like, yeah, now we're fucking on it. Let's do it. And every type of resistance he would give me, I had the good way to like come back at it. So it turned that conflict into like almost like a game in a way. And it became more so, I guess, like fulfilling to create those things. So because I knew what was happening is like that contraction would happen, and I would be like, oh, okay, great, thank you, this is where I want to go to, and then tether down. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to allow you to contract again. Oh, how much can you contract? How much can you contract? How much can you, and then and for me, it was all related to physics. And then when I connected physics to psychology of how we create structural tension, like you said, with sometimes, yeah, it's all flowing, but sometimes you need to move things around. And if we envision ourselves as a river, what controls the river? The river don't control anything. It's just flowing. But when you start to shift those heavy rocks that are at the bed, then you can change the direction of the river. So this is kind of where I took the position of saying, okay, this is a good reason to expand into that resistance that's within my life. And I looked at that personally with, when it stretched out to relations, because I made that first change, you know, internally. And then when I looked at it in my relations, you know, this was after like, you know, I stopped dating for a while. It was just like, okay, what the fuck is happening? And started to really be like, okay, how can you leverage this? And this went through the whole process, right? Like deep solitude with self, and just me, right? And just us, all of us, the whole faculty. And right, the whole council. We all going through this. We all alone. So let's do this because we're all one. Yeah, that's when I shifted alone to all one, but we're not gonna go there. But going into that relational space, it was like, okay, if I can see this person and I've shifted all of this stuff, I'm not gonna come into my relationship like, oh, well, I did this and I did this. This is how I move things. No, because then that's how I associate with my conflict. I am aware that the conflict is gonna happen. So if I'm aware of it, I have to not just be aware, like, oh, that thing is there, and then like, oh, when it happens, then I step in and be like, oh, see, I knew that was gonna happen. No, it's like I can be aware of it, but then be consciously aware of it. And I feel like that is a big difference between giving expansion to your life with resistance. Because if I know that this person is, if I'm going to trigger this person, I know 100% I'm going to trigger you. I need to learn and understand you better. And the only way I can do that excuse me, backtrack. I need to understand and learn you better so that I can hold you when you're triggered and hold space for you when you're triggered and bring you into that space that I've created because we are one. I need to learn and understand you by communicating, by asking you questions, because I know that this is inevitably going to happen. So now I'm not just navigating that conflict. I'm saying, okay, how can I resolve this thing that I know is going to come, you know? So yeah, that's how it looked just interrelationally.
I was
I don't
about
want to
to say, I was
expand
going
that.
to ask you that. I was kind of going to ask you that because I know, like, I mean, I know you have this relationship with resistance, and it's really like, I feel like expanded your capacity to bear pressure, I want to say, like bear weight and alchemize that. And then I was kind of wondering, because I feel like that's a real personal mastery that you have. And how does that then show up in the relational space for you? Like, because I'm guessing that's not, because I definitely know that I don't lean into resistance. I definitely know I don't do that. So I'm like really curious, like most people don't. So I'm like curious how that shows up, like in that relational space where you're like a lot more comfortable with that. And do you find that there's like, what like dynamics generally show up around that?
Yeah, beautiful question because that is a huge one that really came about. I can say the biggest one was the sense of trust. Like, and I don't want to go too deep into like contrast and like simultaneous contrast, but I always feel like what we are internally, once we shift that, we attract the opposite. You know what I mean? And when we understand that polarization for ourselves, then we can understand better how to meet these things that come to us. So what I was noticing is that in my relationships, I was always attracting women, and I'm saying this because I'm taking the responsibility because I chose to like be with him even though I saw it. I was attracting these women that were, either cheated on or betrayed or lied to or whatever, so these narratives would come up because I had tendencies like that before. Like I was never a cheater, but I definitely did like omit a lot of truth, and one of my coping mechanisms was like deceit, to like use that as leverage. Like, oh, well, you don't know this and you didn't ask me, so I'm not going to tell you. And that's just like vulnerability. So when these things would come up in the relational space, I know that it's my trigger if you're not trusting me. But I had alchemized that already, so it wasn't necessarily a trigger to me. I was noticing it and going like, okay, like I didn't give you any reason to not trust me. So instead of coming back with that, it was like, okay, I see that this is coming from this place, and what you're noticing is something from your past, and this is present and it's reminding you. So this is the conflict that's presenting itself, which is why I shifted out of using the term triggers, and I like to use flared imprints, because it's a moment of time that we experience, and there was like a flare up there. And if it's not dealt with and not resolved, then it's going to revolve and it's going to come back into that future. So that was the main thing that kept coming up. So what that taught me was to really communicate clearly with my partner of what safety was, and ultimately at that time, I didn't know what I was communicating was safety. But in that moment in time, I was learning and going through the process with them to explain to them like how I'm showing up, how I'm here, how you are hurt, how you can be held, and asking those questions of like what is needed, but also bringing some logic into it and saying like, don't burn me at the cross. You need to see me. because this is me showing up authentically. And also, I think it's important to say for men also to stand in that, you know, and don't let yourself be disallowed. I mean, don't disallow yourself to be swayed, because you're supposed to be that pillar for that woman. It doesn't matter if your authenticity, you know, challenges her or may create that conflict. You need to know and be able to communicate and like draw up that picture for some women to see that resolution that's on that other side. Because when a woman shows up in that emotional state of that trigger, she can't see, you know, everything is cloudy, everything is confusing, you know, all these distrust, the emotions, the hormones, everything comes up, you know. And I'll also say the same thing for men too. You know, a lot of times there have been men that, like, you know, been cheated on, and the same thing happened to me, you know. So it was like, how do you navigate that? So I think, just to kind of surmise that, it's taking that self mastery and how do we apply that mastery into the world and into our dynamic, I think brings healthy resolve.
Yeah, because it's one thing. I think it's really, really interesting, because I think it is, you're right. It's really one thing to do that self-work with oneself, by oneself. But in the relational space, that like this, like suddenly it's a dynamic. It's not just about what you do. It's not even just about what the other person does. It's how those two things start to play out with each other. And I think you said a really important word, actually, which I really, really think is so important, which is trust. And I think so when we're talking about like leaning into the resistance, I think there is something about this, like where there is something really fruitful for us when we can stay with something that's uncomfortable. But the difference between staying with something that's uncomfortable that leads us to a place of fruitfulness and bounty, and something that's productive, something that's actually recreating patterns of destruction or dysfunction or unhealthiness, and then really that the word for me is trust, right? Because like I was listening to another podcast. I'm like obsessed now with listening to podcasts with old married couples talking about like just obsessed. So I just watched another one is called The Sacred Speaks, and it's with a couple, Annie Lamont and Neil Allen. I'm just writing it down here. And so they were kind of talking a little bit how they resolve conflict, and then he was kind of the husband, he was kind of explaining that like they have something called like benefit of the doubt, which is essentially basically giving your partner like the most generous interpretation of their actions. Because obviously if you're in a conflict, right, and like you said, for example, when people are bringing past stuff, you know, we're all bringing our stuff with us into our relationships. Our past is right here in our relationships, right? And we both people have their triggers, right? And then I think that like the key thing is that there's a level of trust and benefit of the doubt that you offer to your partner or the person that you're in conflict with, that you know that ultimately, I think he sort of said it in the podcast, was like, you know, ultimately I know when she gives me some piece of feedback that he'd rather not hear, he kind of gives her the benefit of the doubt. He thinks, well, she's telling me this for a reason. You know, he doesn't, you know, it's a bit like even, you know, you see it with like crying babies, for example. I mean, it's maybe not the same, but like, you know, it depends what you
I think it is the same. Most adults are like crying babies.
Well, in a way, yeah, because some people would say, hey, baby's in distress, right? It's telling you something. Put it on the boob, give it a cuddle, do what needs to be done. Other people are like, no, it's just they're just seeking attention, ignore them. You know what I mean? So people have different ways of
responding. Harsh.
Well, I think so as well. But anyway, I mean, maybe not, people don't do that with, well, some people do. There was like a kind of thing around how you train your babies to sleep and all this. Anyway, but you know, the point that I'm trying to make is that you can take someone's behavior and interpret in a certain type of way, or you can give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think that really will make a big difference as to how possible. I don't think leaning into resistance, unless your name is Max, leaning into resistance just isn't an enjoyable thing. Like it's just really not like, you know, for most of us, not what we want to do. But I do think when you have that level of trust in this space, like you said, really important thing, safety, trust, giving each other the benefit of the doubt, so that there is a container for for that uncomfortableness, for the rub, for the difficulty. Because if you really do think that like everything that's coming out of the other person's mouth is that they're lying, they're just saying that, or they're whatever, like, you know, and regardless whether that's men or women, like that doesn't matter. In that, we know we're talking about relationships here, but in any kind of relationship, if you know, if you really don't give that, if you don't give props to the person that you're in conflict with, if you really just think that, oh, think they're either just attention seeking, or they're just lying, or they just want, or whatever it is, some like kind of negative narrative that you've attached to them, then I think it's very, very difficult to resolve from that place. And so I think trust and benefit of the doubt are really, really like really, really important tools.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think they're amazing tools. And I would just want to like add two different aspects to that. Is when you mentioned like trust and safety, I dropped those things very well. Safety was a little bit more landing. The trust thing was what the actual trigger was. That's what was coming up and how the dynamic played out, because they were seeing these things and couldn't trust me. So ultimately, exactly what you said is like, if you're unable to see that, for me, I'm like, as men, I think this is what we need to do more so. If we're going to take our strength and like capacity and endurance and stamina and like willing to hold this and all of this, that, and the protector and provider, all these labels that we think that we are, if we're going to use that, then utilize it for this good. So I think when you said leaning into the resistance, I think it's important that this question was more so, where can I expand more into the resistance? So when I see that as a man, I'm like, okay, if I expand to this capacity and I did all of that by myself, then when I have a partner enter my space, then I'm able to preserve her, and not just like looking at her as an object or whatever. It's like, whatever she comes with, I know that I'm out here. So even if what she brings like contracts me down a little bit, it's like, oh, okay, babe, like, yeah, that's not me. I'm not a liar. I'm not this. Have I ever done anything to you like that? Oh, okay. And you still create a safe space where your limits and your boundaries aren't touching her or suffocating her. Because then for me, that is the conflict. The conflict is like the two things touch, you know? So I always look at my orbit and my presence as a space, you know? So if I can create more, then I can not necessarily hold more or go through more or endure more. No, it's like, I can invite somebody in, and whatever you come in with, I know that it's not going to affect me that way, but I can hold more space for you to let that shit out. And then we can move that out, and that ultimately creates safety. Because when a person comes into a space where they feel like they can breathe, if they've been living a life of like suffocation and you don't really have like that, you know, that space to like expand, and you really haven't done that for yourself, and you're in somebody's presence that makes you feel like, oh, I can actually like do this. And when all this stuff starts coming out and the person's like, yeah, no, that's not me. Yeah, okay, let's deal with that. Oh, well, maybe that's this. And you can, that for me is like the alchemizing.
I think you know, absolutely. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that that's where I tie in the benefit of the doubt, because now I don't look at that person like, oh, you're just coming in here blaming me with all this stuff. Oh, you're pointing at me. You're thinking I'm lying. I'm like, no, I'm giving this person the benefit of the doubt. Like, I know you're not talking about me because I know me. I know this is not pointed at me because I know me. So I can look at you and offer you the benefit of the doubt in that space and say, okay, like, this is just that stuff that's coming out. Great. Like,
and cool. That's also, you know, and I was just going to say, like, how those kinds of points get resolved also is what creates trust over time. And I think trust is something that's built over time as well. I don't think that's just something that's like just a given. I think that comes over like resolving conflict, from what I understand from my from my little.
So you mean like if a person's like trust was dismantled or like, you know, betrayed or whatever the case is, because there are some people that out there that do just like trust willy-nilly, and sometimes that's the conflict. It's like, oh, I'm trusting too much.
Yes.
Then you need to figure that shit out. But
yeah, and it's a balance, right? And it's like, you know, But I just wanted to pick up something you said as well, because I do think, like, I think as a woman, I can speak for myself, and I think I can speak for maybe a lot of women that I speak to, particularly if you're having relationships with men. Safety is such a big thing. And I mean, physical safety, one, yes, but emotional safety now, you know, this is like a really big thing. And I think, you know, I think where that can be an issue in conflicts is when, you know, because conflict does bring out different things in us. Like it's bringing up, like you said, like in your shadow, your, like all of these like really difficult parts of us basically come into the relational space. And I think there is a lot of associations, I think, for women around like, say, like physical and emotional safety when you're having a conflict, like, because yeah, I think that is really, really important. I think it's really, really important for men to know how important that is for women, because then I think that is definitely, like, often half the battle, depending on what you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about just leaving socks on the floor, or, you know, not putting your dirty washing in the basket or whatever, like, I mean, those are like repeat arguments that come up over and over again. Like those are I mean, I've got friends, they're married for 13 years, they're still having this argument, and they love each other to bits, they're not going anywhere, but they are still having this argument today. I said, have you not ironed this out? Have you not resolved this? No, apparently not.
Well, because that's the healthy conflict.
I mean,
right?
It's kind of like they obviously, and apparently, I mean, and the Gottman said it as well, like, where these are like the little things that you argue over, right? Like, you know, and then there's the big things. There's the big things where, like, often it's your childhood stuff's coming in, or your past experiences coming, you know, and all of that kind of stuff, like, starts to bear weight. And I do think on those types of issues, I think for women, half the battle, like literally half of it is won by just knowing that there's safety in that place. So in terms of leaning, when you talk about leaning in or expanding into that resistance, or like being able to expand into those conflicts, I do really think that's like, it's massive.
And I would just say, like, even for men, you know, that is one of the biggest things. And I can definitely hear, like, you know, whatever guys that have listened to this thus far, first of all, hit that like and subscribe button, because you're hearing this right now and about to drop a gem on you, because you know it's really real. Y'all, like, if it's half the battle, why she not pulling up with half the battle already done? And like, safety, why safety gotta be on me? And and it's like, bro, this is the point of, like, understanding that if you are a safe and secure individual, and that's where the distinction is like, innately it's security that we want to possess, and we want to give this woman security and be the protector, and you're putting that out. You're attracting that in. You're attracting that opposite, that polar opposite. So you have to really embody that safety and that security to show up for this person. So you really have to ask yourself that question, is like, when this person comes to you and you're so-called providing safety and security, how come you're not providing safety and security for that, of what she needs, you know? And this is something I explain to guys all the time, is like that difference between security and safety. And yes, you can do all the work by yourself, but when that person shows up, like we said, we have to understand, like, when she's showing up and she doesn't, and you're not creating enough space for her, even to just feel safe or whatever, you're not giving her a shelf on your dresser drawer and nothing to, like, put her clothes, but like, you want all these fantastic things for her. You want her to cook you breakfast and dinner and all this nonsense. It's like, bro, you're not even giving her physical space. So what makes you think that metaphysically or emotionally you're going to be able to create space? So this is the part where, like, men's systems, they come into, like, dysregulation, or they start to disassociate with that security. And then you're like, oh, well, why do I have to provide you safety? Why do I have to do this? Why do I? Nigga, because ain't that who you are? That's who you want to be, right? That's what you're trying to put out. You got to embody that, though. So when you're embodying that, you are bringing that into your body, and you're emanating and you're divinating it. Like, that is your divine frequency. That is your divine state. You are just consistently in that. So you're going to be able to provide that in whoever comes into your space. So that's kind of like this third question that we brought up, is about knowing when our system is dysregulated, or when we're, you know, disassociated, or when that coping mechanism kicks in. And also when we're activated or flooded or frozen. You know, this is all central nervous system stuff, of why I consistently say it's important for men specifically to go through that first phase. You know, these are like rites of passages that, you know, I'm bringing and I'm injecting into the program of Summit to bring to these men in this guidance system of solitude. You need to be doing nothing with nobody because you need to learn your system. Because if you don't know your system, how can you show up in a space and expect somebody to do for you or give you what you think you need or what you think you want or what you think is healthy for you? You don't even know how to regulate your own system. And let's take it a step further about you don't even know how to go through your emotional system. So for me, I mean, yes, I did, you know, my schooling in therapeutics and, you know, degree in health science, all these other things, but I had to do the fucking work too, you know? And for me, I'm the type of person, my conviction is ridiculous because that's also one of my other coping mechanisms of I used to have a lot of blinding optimism. I get so convicted about something, I'm like, oh no, you're my person. That's it. And then all the focus would be on that. And it's like, nope, you can't do that. Oh, this person is just like you. They're never going to do this. Nope. And I would understand and have that security within myself that, oh, I can navigate that conflict. I can navigate this situation. I can, you know, create this space to make it what I want, you know, rather than seeing it for what it is, because that's what happens to our systems. You know, when we get super activated and we have this sense of, oh, I want to be secure. I want to make sure my girl's secure. I'm going to pay for all the bills. I'm going to do all this. And you're out there moving away from your center, doing all of these things. You're putting up a false sense of security. And which is why I love that word insecurity, because when you think of somebody that's insecure, you think of somebody that, you know, doesn't really have it. They're like kind of weary. They're like mad skeptical and like, oh, well, what? Like, why should be? And when you look at the word, that would mean that you're in a state of security. So why is there this opposite polar, like, preconceived notion of it, you know? And really for me, it's like unsecurity, because you're under this state of being secure within yourself that you have to do all of these things and you step outside of yourself and you don't ultimately create a safe space for a woman. Like, yes, you can go out and pay for the bills and pay the rent and find your pride and all that. Great. But also, where are those other spaces where you might be giving her financial security, or you may be giving her, you know, physical security, like a home, but where is the actual state of safety? It's more quantitative than it's qualitative, you know? And for me, I've always thought about that, of how it regulates to the system, because if I'm only taking care of my body physically, right, and I'm working out and I'm, you know, fucking drinking green juice, whatever you think, you know, makes your body feel great, but I'm not ultimately understanding like why I'm going to the gym, why I'm doing these things. You know, if I have this fear in the back of my head that my grandfather died of a heart attack and I want to, and that's why I'm trying to stay healthy so I don't die early, then I'm doing it for the wrong reasons. I'm acting out of fear, you know? So now my system is flooded with this system, I mean, with this chemical of fear. So you act out of that, you know? So it's important to identify your system in those ways when you disassociate from yourself physically, emotionally, mentally, so that you can actually show up for these people and actually show up in resolve and not just perpetuating that conflict, because it all comes from your system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a real key thing you said. Like, I think that this is, I think conflict can be really activating. I want to say argument, but conflict in general, because like, I guess an argument feels like a thing, an actual thing, whereas conflict can feel rumble on for a long time, you know what I mean? So it could be like, you know, so like, I guess, like conflict kind of feels like a longer road, whereas an argument feels like a you know, a one-time event. But oh
my God, we really are polar opposites, because I was thinking you were saying the exact opposite. Holy shit. I feel like arguments are just like, bro, like this is going on forever. But like conflict is like, oh, this is happening right now. Like this too shall pass. Oh, that's so crazy. That's why I love this podcast. I love having these conversations, because it's like, you never know. I thought we were on the same page. It was just like, actually, here's the kicker. Oh my gosh. But I do think
Have a
there's a
bit of
huge
contrast. We gotta
distinction
have a bit of
between
contrast.
argument and conflict, for sure. So, yes, continue, please.
Um, yeah, no, and I think it's really, really important to know, to be aware when you're activated, when you're dysregulated. I do really think conflict can bring up a lot for us. I mean, I think like, and particularly, I think for any of us, especially when either, if you don't feel heard, if you don't feel or even if you're not used to, speaking your needs. And goes for men and women, because I do feel like we're all
Hmm.
these are like skills we're all learning. And I think it's really important to say that, like, I think it's okay if you're in a conflict and there is dysregulation. I think it's really important to take yourself out of space, and give yourself space, or give your partner some space, or give the person you're in a conflict with, like, just to give them some space, in order to allow the nervous system to calm down and then come back at it from that place. Because I do definitely think, one thing is for sure, if anyone is in an activated state, there's not much anything is going to get resolved, because everyone's just either in a high, whatever that is, like the emotions are flooded, that there's a free state happening, that a withdrawal happening, a shutdown happening, like a completely activated, all right, let's go at it and let's not stop, and what I mean, until somebody wins, like either way.
And just have sex at that point. I mean, it's like push
this
the
is definitely
conflict
one way of
until,
resolving. I mean, this is what Max, like,
yeah, push the conflict until you have to pull the condom. Like, fuck it. Just, you gotta feel out in the dark and just be like, all right, fuck it, we activate it. Let's do it. All right,
I mean,
we
I
can resolve it
definitely
now.
yeah. No, I definitely think that is, yeah. True.
That's just one outlet to
Yeah, that's
say. So no,
definitely.
I think it's super important, like you said, to be able to notice,
But if you
and
don't yet, but that's what I'm gonna say. If you don't know what's happening in your own body, then it's even
right.
hard to communicate that. If you don't even know what's happening for yourself, I mean, and I would definitely say this for a lot of people, like, to be able to identify what you're feeling, to understand what that means to you, and to know why that's happening, and then to be able to communicate that, I think is massive. And then, you also have to have someone who's receptive, who has something, understands that. But otherwise, things are just flying around in the space, and that's just all, and like that just can create a lot of chaos. And actually, if we want to resolve stuff, then really we want to get down to the root.
Yeah.
And I think you've got more chance of that if you're in a centered space, if you're really like in your center. But the thing about it is, this conflict gets us, you know what I mean? So there's a real balance, like, continually on, like, I think, yeah, like, being able to find your center, come back into the space, and actually create resolution, or like I said, or just have sex. If
Right. If that does it for you. I mean, yeah, and I feel like that kind of ties into, what I offer to men, is like that understanding of, because for me, I find that as like honorable, like as a partner, to have so much space, and I find it beautiful because I know that the conflict is going to come. I know that I'm going to trigger you. I know that it's going to happen. And it's just a matter of time. And like, for me, I have this deep knowing, and it's just like, oh, I have to create this space and like make it, and like you're here. And when it comes out, like, just like you said, all that stuff is flying all over the place. It's chaos. Like, for me, that's beauty. That's like the feminine energy at her most raw. And for me, I see like an honor in that, and almost like a privilege in a way, to be able to see that woman or this partner. Like, I don't definitely do this with like any fucking body else. Like, it's like, I'm not gonna hold that space for you. Like, if you my manager, like, you just some person out on the street, like, nah, fuck all that. Like, miss me with the bullshit. Go turn your little tornado somewhere else. Like, I don't got no space for you, So because it's a sense of like that you value, I value my space. So to have a person invited into that, and to be able to see that rawness and that chaos and that messiness just all over the place, it's like, wow, like, thank you for that. That's an honor. Like, I'm privileged to be here. Like, Like, how can I show up? How can I stand here? Because all I really have to be is like, be myself, be still, so that you don't have to be still. Like, I know at some point that storm will calm and she will find her center, you know? But sometimes I feel like, just as men, we need to create that so that women can go to that space, you know? They can go to that limit and really expand into that resistance, because a lot of women do have resistance against being in that chaos, being ferocious, being fucking angry, being rageful. Like, go ahead, be that, you know? Like, if I'm, let's just, for example, hypothetically, if I'm a true man, right? And I'm like, I can beat any woman in the world, if that's the man that you think you are, right? And you're in that center, she's going crazy, she's wilding. Why would you get emotional and take up more of that space? It's like, what's she gonna do? Beat you up? Nah, she can't beat you up. I mean, I know some girls that'll beat you up. They came from my hood, and I think, now that I'm reflecting on that, maybe that's where I got that from. Was because I saw, and yeah, I was beat up by a girl too before. Yeah, actually. But just to know that, like, yeah, huh.
Actually, we have to caveat here. No, because we have to caveat here, because there are some men do suffer from domestic abuse, and actually abuse is actually a little more complicated than just physical. I mean, there's fear, there's intimidation, there's like all of that.
Right.
So
and there's also like emotional abuse, verbal abuse,
absolutely,
all of those different things.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the part also where I would refer them to, you know, Don Miguel's book and be like, hey, don't take it personal, you know, because all of those things that come in, if you have done, and this is what I'm saying, is like, when you get to that point where you're able, and I'm only speaking for myself in this moment in time, it's like, that's why I said it was a hypothetical. If you're a man that's capable of creating that much space to be able to witness, because that's a fucking rarity. Like, no man, not many men get to see that. So if you a guy that's on the other end and your experience, like, ignore the whole part of this podcast, because it takes an amount of sustainability for yourself to get to that place of understanding that none of that is directed at you. You know, none of that is penetrating you, because you are safe. And the only way you're able to provide safety is if you believe, know, and have faith, and is convicted and devoted to your safety and security as an individual. There's no possible way that we can give something that we don't have. So there's no way that I can resolve this situation and all this chaos that happens if I don't have that myself. Because then we're just both in a space and we both don't have an answer, and then we're both not tethered down and we both can't find our center, and then we're just up, we're fucking around, and then we end up having sex, and then we just end up falling down, and we just end up falling into our own space. And then we're in different rooms, and then it happens again the next day, and then you're in a toxic relationship.
But then again, I go like, sorry, the Gottman Bible. They were like, well, if two people like that, they're just like, you know what I mean? Like, some people are like that's, you know, that's the kind of.
I've 100% had that.
I think if two people are happy with however their dynamics are, then I think that's all that really matters. But then I think it's only if you're not. And I do think there's something really, really important that you said, though, talking about this, because I do think women's emotionality can be very triggering for men, particularly in the relational space. And so I do think you're absolutely right. Like, if men don't have a certain level of groundedness, awareness, connectedness, then yes, like, as a woman, your emotionality can be incredibly triggering. And I think it's also like that feeling of I think that feeling of having disappointed. You're like, I think there's something around that of feeling like you've let your woman down, or letting your just like, I think there's something around that, just kind of feeling like, you know, because I do think there's something around men. I do feel like the motivation is around, you know, being the protector, being the carer, being like looking after. And actually, when a woman's unhappy or in her emotions, there is something that feels like that's a personal attack upon oneself. You know what I mean? And that can be then triggering, and then that can just create a whole like you know, top of on top of on top of on top of. So I think these are some of the just dynamics to be aware of. I think it happens in any, you know, any dynamic of relationship, but I definitely think this is like this is a common one, I think, between men and women. And
and even men and men, to be honest.
Well,
like when you're, you know, when you are around your business partner, even when you're playing ball, it's like you got people that's in your ear all the time talking mad shit. If you emotional, bruh, you're not gonna make your next shot. You're gonna be in your feelings, and like now you let somebody into your head. So that's why I say it's so important for men to understand how to create space. We need to become our own personal alchemist before any fucking thing. Like, you can't make any progress. I'm sorry. I'm saying it. You can't make any progress unless you learn how to create space. You don't know how to do that, you're going to be living in conflict, period. I don't know. I think that really, I haven't seen it.
But it's kind of what we spoke about in our previous episodes. You know, when either are we responding or are we reacting? You know, and really want to become like it from a responsive place, particularly in conflict, where we're being very conscious and deliberate about what we're saying, how we're saying it, how we're showing up. Because, you know, if we're just coming from a reactive place, then, like you said, like you're not actually really in control. And much about being aware of what's happening in your body is about being able to then control what you say, how you show up, how you act, because you are in a state of, well, regulation, right? Regulators, mount up.
That's a fact.
But yeah, like it's, you know, like but you've got to be able to know what's happening in your own body. And I think that's definitely been, and I think these are some of the things, I mean, maybe just like some practical things for our audience, just thinking about what ways can you know if you're like activated, flooded, disassociated. And I think one of the things, you know, like obviously like heart rate faster, like not being able to like articulate yourself, like even wanting to withdraw, shut down. I think like disassociated is one of the hardest ones, I think, to identify in yourself, because usually you're not even in your body, you're not even like there. I think a lot of dissociation I associate with like scrolling, mindless scrolling, like kind of just being like, because you're, or, you know, or just doing something where you're not
the
even
autonomic system.
You're just kind of
disassociated from your body and your mind.
You're not.
And
even...
I would just say for that is like, definitely if you're that person, or if you feel like that resonates but you're not necessarily sure, I would say to look into somatic work in a sense of like, you know, I usually tend to tell guys like a little bit more somatically to get into your body, because we tend to disassociate from our bodies, and then we're just in the mind and we're like, okay, how can I just like make this thing? And it's like, start to focus on little things that are in that person's body first. You know, notice how their hands are squeezing, how their mouth is moving. Focus on little details, and then focus on those details in your body. Okay, how are my lips? Is my eyebrows pursed? Like, is my jaw tensing up? Do I feel tightness in my chest, in my low back, whatever? So bringing that mind to the body, you start to bridge that connection again with the somatic part of it. And then to take it a step further, you can throw in the kinesthetics and maybe squeeze the hands or squeeze the shoulders together. Like, bring yourself some activation into the body, because that disassociation means that you're deactivated. So you want to kind of activate the body, or if you're disassociated from the mind, start thinking about things like, oh, wow, what is the tone that she's speaking with? You know, like, bring yourself back to that present moment, because the present moment gives us everything back into that space, into our system, to know that it's okay, you know? And yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because that's one of those huge things, is like identifying, you know, what these key indicators are, because everybody's body is different languages, everybody's mind has different languages, and it's up to us to learn them. And these are a lot of the things that we've spoken about, because we come through these challenges in our life. You know, yes, we're speaking about it relationally and masculine, feminine. We're using all of these different containers, and we're building upon this. If you've listened to most of the episodes that we've done, definitely continuous, and it's a progressive and evolutionary theme, but we have these difficulties, and a lot of them come with lessons that we have, you know. There's always lessons in the conflict, there's always learnings within our flared imprints, and we can bring these things into the light as we go through the situations, you know. So with our last question, which is, you know, what lessons lie behind those difficulties? So I want to ask you this, Shaka, just with what you were saying, and the picture that you painted from, you know, dysregulated bodies, and the way that these things come up, and how trust is of such importance to be able to lean into that resistance within our lives, and then also how that relates to conflict, you know. How would you say that there, if these are all difficulties and we look at conflict as a difficulty through your lens that you just painted, what would be that lesson to bring to resolve any of this conflict?
Yeah, such a such a good question. I think a biggest lesson really is that I think two things. So two things are coming to my mind. They're kind of related, but I guess the first one is that often, and I think, I don't know, something we learn in childhood, but when there's conflict, like when, you know, someone's not happy with us, or we're not happy with them, or like, you know, there's a kind of issue that happens, I think that we can internalize that and start to think there's something, you know, that's a reflection of us, and depending on how we understand that, you know, can really, you know, and I've had this, so definitely, like like I've said this many times in the show, like where, you know, someone might say something, they might just have a bad day, but I take that personally. I just think, oh my God, like they upset with me. And then, like, you know, and it can really, and it's like, it's silly, because even, you know, I was actually talking to my friend about this, and we were like, you know, even in your head, you might know different, but sometimes that's something that's like learned, where you feel like, oh no, like I've done something wrong. And like, you know, and that can cause like a real, a little bit of a crisis of confidence, I want to say. And then, so I think like one of the things that's really important to learn is that you can still have conflict or be in conflict and still be lovable. Like, I think that can be really important, maybe like particularly for women, but like, I think, all right, but for everyone, all right. Everyone, absolutely. No, actually, you're absolutely right. No, I shouldn't. No, you're absolutely right. It is everyone, because I do feel like there's something where we can have this idea of ourselves, you know, as bad people, or, you know, awful people, whatever that could be the tape that's on replay, the narrative that goes on. And I think that's a really important thing to learn, is that actually, even in amongst it, yeah, that we are lovable, that there is a place beyond that. And then I think that kind of brings me to my second thing, which is like, it reminds me of, like, you know, we have like little forest fires, like, right? So you have like little forest fires, it kind of burns down all the dry stuff, and then it actually allows things to grow fresh and healthy again. And this is what I said at the beginning, we have to know the difference between like a little forest fire that actually creates more growth, and fires that just burn down the whole place and nothing's ever coming. You know what I mean? It's like really
burn it at the roots.
Yeah, exactly. You know,
like what they're doing in Costa Rica, and everybody needs to help and donate and find the cause to stop it. But anyway,
mate,
after you hit that like and subscribe button.
Yeah. But yeah,
you're not going to tell them the truth about Costa Rica.
Oh man, yeah, they're cutting down trees like a rate of knots. It's actually very heartbreaking. Buildings going up left, right, center. But anyway, but the truth is, we're still in the jungle. But yeah, no, I think those are the two things, is that trusting that process, that actually that something really fruitful can come out the other side. It's a normal part of life, difficulty, internal difficulty, and interpersonal difficulties. It's a normal part of life, and it's how we learn each other. It's how we deepen connection. It's how we actually build more resilience in our relationships. And if we can trust that process, then I think there's a you know, you can really start to deepen it can really deepen connection.
Mm.
And obviously through the process is to not, you know, not have that tape playing, you know, about how awful you are. Yeah,
Mm.
I would say.
It's so beautiful. I feel like I can still be lovable. I mean, I always know that I am, but they just have to realize that. But no, I think that was so beautiful. And the thing that came to me was kind of like on the outskirts of what you said, I guess, to kind of almost encapsulate it a little bit, which is, I think the biggest lesson behind difficulties is intimacy. Like it's deepened my level of intimacy because of the intimacy that I've grown. And I say intimacy in a sense of closeness, just being close to something and getting close to it without not, necessarily touching it or having an intention or whatever. It's like I had to go inside and gain this level of self intimacy first, and with this shadow, with these coping mechanisms, with these, adaptive strategies, with this mutable Pisces energy, and see, like, hey, like, how can I get to know you? Okay, great. I got to know you. Fantastic. Now, remember, there's like this other world outside. We're going to both go outside. And then it's like you go hand in hand with that into the relational space, with a partner or within a business or within a friendship or whatever. And it's like you bring that same level of like, hey, like, this is my other side. Like, this is who I am. He's going to trigger the fuck out of you, but don't worry, because I know how to love you, like, right after that, and it's like, it's okay. And also, look at all this space I've created, like, now that you're in here and like you want to come to my place. And it builds this level of like being able to be intimate with this other person. And also it's helped me be intimate with the world too, just through traveling, going to, Costa Rica, going to Germany, coming here to Colombia, many different places. Like, I have this deep intimacy of, and not to be like super esoteric, but just like namaste, like I see that and I recognize that one in you. And like, because I've been there and I'm able to look at this with resolve, like, yes, conflicts may come up, but how am I going to resolve this without being responsible for it, because that's also a thing for me as well. And I think a lot of men can relate to that, is when we see a problem, like, we got to fix it. Like, that's my responsibility to fix it. It's like, sometimes it's not, sometimes the best thing to do is like do nothing, like, that's not your shit. So learning also that level of intimacy with the world, that there can be wars that are going on the other side of the world, and I can feel connected to it. I can feel that deep sorrow. I can feel that deep pain, but also know that it's not my responsibility to bear that weight, that I have that closeness and I have that intimacy with the same people that are, starving in Africa, to the same people that are starving in Michigan, that I have that level of intimacy to see that closeness, but also not bear that weight of that responsibility. So I think ultimately that has given me, and that has been the biggest lesson of like how to maintain freedom and liberation, because I feel like at the deep core of all of us, yes, we may have learned to navigate conflict, but there's also a strength in that. We've learned to master these waters, we've learned to master these rhythms and these patterns of this world, and the duality of light and dark and good and bad, and whether it be in the relational space or within the global space. But that is a strength. And then if we turn that into a tool to resolve issues, then we're actually pouring back into that balance and helping out that positive and that negative of your relationship or the world. But also, we are free from that choice of navigating that conflict or being responsible for that resolve. And we just understand that we're free and we're one, and everything is going to be okay. And if we come from that space of safety and love, then we're gifted that trust, we're gifted that intimacy, we're gifted so many states of being that, you know, just like you said, with that yogic practice of just, you just become that, you know, and like that's your path and you emanate that, and that is your divine right. I think, yeah, that's pretty much the dilemma and the advice tied up there as well. And as far as advice, yeah, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, well, talking about advice, it was just made me think about one of the things that the Gottman said in their thing. Was it something like this ridiculous percentage? It was like 70-something% of like all conflicts will never get resolved. And they were like,
67.
Was it something, yo, you're so good. Like you remember. Yeah. Like it was like something ridiculous like that. Like a lot of the conflicts will never get resolved. And that's okay. Like, that's okay. Like actually they didn't seem too worried about it. They were like, yeah, it's fine. You can figure it out. Yeah. It's like it's like, okay, cool. Yeah. Like they are like, you know, and also actually, I just have something else that I thought was really, really useful. It's apparently like conflicts, like, or sometimes called power struggles, right? Really boil down, often in relationships, boil down to one of three things often. So one is power and control. Two is trust, care, and closeness. And three is respect and recognition. So I think sometimes that can be useful as well, because if you think you're kind of arguing about something that's nothing's new under the sun, you know, and that actually sometimes it can be useful that actually boil it all down. I mean, you really take out all the details and the unique situations, the unique personalities involved. Actually, what are these? What is the foundation? What is like the, you know, like when we root down, what are these conflicts really, really about? And often they boil down to one of these three things. And I think that can be useful, because then you really know, oh, actually, what are you? What are you fighting for? Yeah. Take my
that's
I don't need it. It's always a song. Sorry,
that's so interesting, because out of those three things, I hear ego and superficiality, like the persona in all of that. So maybe that should be an interesting tie into our next episode for creating habits and everyday commitment. So that's so really of the things that we do are fighting, because it's our egos consistently clashing, which is why I'm such a huge advocate for just befriending your ego. You don't need to kill it, befriend it, so that you can bring 2 times of you to the table for your partner. Because why wouldn't your partner want double dose of you? Come on. But so thank you guys for tuning in today. I hope that you wrote down some of these gems that came through. There was so much more, and especially if you're navigating conflict or having some difficulty with healthy resolution, a lot of these practices are definitely beneficial, and you have to just remember to learn your language, take your time, give yourself grace, and just remember, don't take anything personally. And if you want some more access to some of the practices, there's going to be a link in there for that blog post that I referred to earlier. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, because these episodes are going up. And yes, we want to keep you guys a little bit more engaged. And if you have any other like episode requests, please send them in the comments. And if you got anything to say and you like us, don't text us and tell us. Put it in the comments, because there's other people out there that's asking the same questions as you asking, and they got the same thing on your mind. So with that being said, Shaka, thank you so much. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.
And we will see you guys on the next episode. Thank you guys for tuning in.
Thank you guys. See you next time.
If you like this episode, please support the podcast and the channel by subscribing, liking, sharing, or donating. You will also find all of the show notes and questions in the description, along with important links and contact details.